Hi class, this is a short video on the interpretive essay. The first one, the historical narrative essay. First, you need to decide if you want to write on the Exodus story or the story of Esther. I recommend reading both of them and then choosing, but they're almost equal in length, being the Exodus story is about 14, or is 14 chapters, the Esther story is 12 chapters. So they'll take about the same amount of time to read. You're probably pretty familiar with the Exodus story since it has been in so many Hollywood movies. The Esther story has been made into one Hollywood movie, but it's like 4 hours long and old and, well, not that good. Anyways, pick one of those two, and then you're going to write a 2 to 3 page essay where you need to do the following things. First, you need to indicate the temporal, physical, and cultural settings of the narrative. So there is a setting in which the story takes place, and it has 3 different types. So there's the temporal, or the time in which the story takes place. And you need to discuss this in 2 terms. One, global terms. What was the date in which the story took place? So for the Moses story, the Exodus story in chapters 1 through 14, when was Moses alive? And that will give you a rough date about when the story took place. Not only globally, though, you need to place it into a temporal setting within the character's lives. So how old was Moses when the story was taking place? Moses actually ages quite a bit as the story progresses, and part of your task is to identify the temporal setting or the age of the characters and how that changes during the story. The physical setting is where the story takes place. So you need to tell me in your essay, in a paragraph or so, where the story is taking place. And if that changes, you need to tell me where the story goes. But not just where, but what the land was like, what the place was like. So for the Exodus story, if it's in Egypt, tell me what Egypt was like during the time of Moses. And Moses actually travels around quite a bit. And they exit out of Egypt. So tell me about what the space was like, where they move into, what would the physical terrain have been like. And then the cultural setting, this is a bit of a more of a challenge, but you need to discuss what the culture would have been like, who the people were, what they were like, who the characters were, and what they were like. You need to discuss, if you're dealing with the book of Esther, what the kingdom would have been like that she was dealing with, what her role as queen would have been, discuss what marriage would have been like as she's married to the king. So different cultural aspects, particularly things that are different than our own context. You need to do a little bit of research and discuss those in a paragraph or so. For more information on the settings, go to your Carver text, page 33, and he talks about the settings. He'll talk about the function of the characters and the conflicts and everything on pages 33, 34, 35 in the Carver text. The next thing that you need to do is describe the main conflicts that drive the plot and the extent to which those conflicts are resolved at the end of the narrative. So what we're looking for here is a discussion of the main conflicts, and there are 3 different types of conflicts that may be prominent within these stories. So the first one is character versus character conflict. This is when 2 characters are in conflict with each other. The next one is character versus environment conflict. This is when the main conflict is between a character and some aspect of the environment. And then there's character versus self. So this is when the character is having internal struggle. Most biblical narratives have all 3 of these conflicts. One is oftentimes primary, but oftentimes they're all 3 intermixed. The Esther story only has 2 of them, but the Exodus story has all 3. So in a paragraph or 2, you're going to discuss the main conflicts and if those conflicts are resolved at the end of the story or not. The next thing you need to do is analyze the functions of the main characters in the narrative. And that goes with this bullet point as well. So there are 4 different types of characters in biblical stories. The protagonist, the proponents, the antagonist, and the foil, those 4 types. So the protagonist is the main character. That doesn't mean that this person is the hero of the story, and it also doesn't mean that this person is God. God is not always the protagonist. Oftentimes, God is not the protagonist. Somebody else is. But the protagonist is, we can normally identify the protagonist by where the focus of the story is, but also the protagonist is the character who changes over time. Oftentimes we'll have characters that begin the story and end the story exactly the same. The protagonist, though, is someone who changes. Their characteristics change, their mind changes, their thoughts are changing. They're rather dynamic. But sometimes the protagonist can be what one might consider a bad person, or might be a good person. That doesn't play into the protagonist aspect. The next one is the proponent. A proponent is just a kind of a prop character. It's a secondary character. Doesn't have many lines. Oftentimes it's a supporting role. So there's going to be many proponents. You identify a couple and discuss them. Then the antagonist. You can identify the antagonist by this character's relationship with the protagonist. The antagonist is the one who is fighting against the protagonist. So this tends to be a very clear relationship. Once you've identified your protagonist, whoever you think is the main character and the character that develops over time, you identify the character that is fighting with the protagonist. A note on the antagonist is that this character doesn't necessarily have to be a person. This is oftentimes the character who, or the other part of the conflict. So if you have your main conflict as character versus environment, then the environment is the antagonist. Right? So you see how that works? The protagonist is the character that you're discussing, the main character, and the thing that the protagonist is in conflict with is the antagonist. So this means that the protagonist and antagonist can actually be the same person. Because if your conflict is character versus self, then the character is the protagonist, and the self, the person that the protagonist is in conflict with, is the antagonist. The foil is a little more complicated. The foil is a secondary character who the author uses to highlight the characteristics of the main character. So in the Abraham story that you've likely read by this point, Lot is a foil. Lot is oftentimes making the exact opposite choice of Abraham, and that choice often leads to Lot being in trouble, and therefore Abraham has to play the hero. So the author uses Lot throughout the story of Abraham to highlight how courageous Abraham is, how he makes good choices. So Lot highlights these characteristics. The role of Lot is to play the foil, to highlight certain characteristics within the character of the protagonist, who is Abraham. Abraham's not always making good choices, but in contrast to Lot, he makes better choices than other characters do. So those are the 4 types of characters. The next thing that you need to do is summarize the point of the narrative, and I want you to focus on these 2 main questions. What does the author seem to be most interested in? So in telling this story, what do you think the author is most interested in? Also ask yourself this question: how is the original author's message reflected in the main theme of the passage? So whatever you think the main theme is, how is the author's message reflected within that? Most stories have a message. They're trying to convince their reader of something, trying to convince their reader to do something or to feel something. What do you think the author of the Exodus or the Esther story is trying to make his or her reader do or feel or think? What's the message? This is the main part of your essay. The first 4 bullet points will likely take up to a page and a half, maybe 2 pages. This one I want you to write almost a full page, basically a full page devoted to answering these questions. So don't just tell me what you think the main message is or what you think the author's message is, but tell me why, and connect it back to your analysis of the narrative. Connect it back to the cultural setting, connect it back to the main conflicts and to the functions of the characters, and tell me why you think the author is talking about certain things, and how the author is doing that. So reflect back on the text and say, I think the author is talking about justice. The author does that by highlighting how Abraham seeks out justice. And here's an example. Here's a verse that I think really highlights the author's main message, that sort of thing. That's what we're looking for. And then you'll close off your essay with a reflection on how the narrative impacted you. And you can write really anything here. Just reflect on how, as you read through this story, as you wrote on this story, how did it impact you as a person? How do you respond to the main message of the author? All right, so we're looking for essentially a 3-page essay. It'll be difficult to do this in just 2 pages, but it'll be in that range. It probably won't be more than 3 pages. You should start with an introduction of some type. Say, I chose the book of Exodus to write on for these reasons, and I'm going to do these things in this essay, and then you're going to do those things. All right, so start with an introduction, then work your way through each of these bullet points. When I grade your essay, I will be looking for each of these bullet points. If you skip one, you will lose significant points. So I recommend that when you're done with your essay, go through it, checking off in your mind each of these bullet points, making sure you've covered all of them. We're going to look for your paper to be formatted in APA, so make sure you review the APA standards, especially with references. If you use any textbook or a website or an article, if you use any outside source, it must be referenced in your paper. Even if it's not a direct quote, even if you're just using the ideas of somebody else. Let me give you an example. When you talk about the temporal setting of your story, let's say you chose the Exodus story, and you say something like, this story took place around 1500 BCE, period. Let's say you wrote that sentence. This story took place around 1500 BCE. Very often, students write something like that and then don't give me a source for where they found that information. I know that you found that information somewhere because it's not common knowledge. Most people don't know when the story took place that's found in Exodus chapter 1 through 14. And unless it's common knowledge, it must be referenced. So if you found that in the Carver text, or if you found that in the Oxford Annotated Bible, you found it online, wherever you found it, even if it's not a direct quote, please put an in-text citation as well as a works cited citation. Also, especially if you use something as a direct quote, you must put it in quotes and give me a reference. If I find that you have used somebody else's words in your paper without giving a reference, that's considered plagiarism and will likely result in a 0 grade, even if your essay is good otherwise. If you have plagiarized somebody else's work, your essay will likely receive a 0 grade. So make sure you're providing references. Also note that oftentimes students find it, for whatever reason, tempting to copy and paste directly from websites like Wikipedia. I've read through Wikipedia for most of these books, like Exodus and Esther, and I'm rather familiar with different websites that give summaries of these books. So please just don't copy and paste from the web. It's quite clear to me that you're using someone else's work. All right, well, it's enough about kind of the doom and gloom stuff there. Just make sure you're properly formatting your paper. Make sure you're properly referencing anybody else's ideas or words that you're using, and you're likely to do quite well. I'm not that picky about APA, but I'm really picky about references, not their format, but that you are using them. Right, so make sure that we're using proper citation. All right, well, shoot me an email if you have any questions at jjacobs@warnerpacific.edu, and I look forward to reading your papers. Thanks.